Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to be learning the 2 to 8 player game, Memoir 44, designed by Richard Borg and published by Days of Wonder, who helped sponsor this video. Here, you'll be recreating stylized portrayals of various historical World War II battles, striving to give your forces the greatest chance at victory. So, join me at the table, and let's learn how to play. Although it can accommodate more, Memoir 44 is typically played by 2 opponents, and that's what I'll be showing you in this video. To set up, you'll pick one of the 16 included scenarios from the game's rulebook, though for your first game, they recommend this one, Pegasus Bridge. Now, because I want to try to show you a variety of situations that you might encounter, I'm instead going to set up a more advanced scenario, this one, the Battle of Sword Beach. Using the picture provided, we'll now lay out the double-sided game board with this beach side face-up as shown here. The other side of the board shows primarily a countryside, which is used in some of the other scenarios. And this entire area is a battlefield made up of spaces known as hexes. We'll now add any special terrain, which will all be listed here, as well as shown on the diagram. And this often comes in the form of these double-sided terrain tiles that replace certain spaces printed on the board. For this scenario, we'll have just a few forests and towns and villages, while other scenarios may include hedgerows, rivers, and hills, which we'll talk about later. Just note that the tiles are double-sided, so if you can't find something you need, just check both sides. Also, there is some variation in the artwork of the tiles. For example, these buildings are different colors and configurations, but they are both considered town and village tiles, so it's okay if they don't match the exact colors of the setup picture. They will still represent the same thing. Following our scenario, we have forests that go here, and these 3 villages. Next, we'll add any non-terrain obstacles. This could include bunkers and bridge tokens, as well as hedgehog, barbed wire, and sandbag pieces. And any that you need will be pictured on the board, and you'll arrange them as shown. It will look like this once you're done, and while you will try to match the colors of the items to what is shown in the scenario, in some cases, as with this one, you may need to use a mix of colors to fill in all of the required spots. And while we will talk about the different types of terrain and obstacles, there are these summary cards provided that you can set nearby to assist you with their rules when you're playing. Now you'll place the required figures on the board, which are represented by these various white rectangles, each picturing the type of troop that they represent. In the rulebook, you'll find this guide which explains what each symbol means. For example, if we see this, then it means that the hex contains 4 infantry figures, like we have here. A tank symbol adds 3 tanks to its space, and artillery is placed in groups of 2. You'll also pay attention to the color shown and place that color of those figures. Now sometimes a unit has more or fewer than the typical number of pieces, and if so, you'll find that number written by the symbol. For example, this means that you'd only add 3 figures to the infantry unit where you would normally have 4. So again, going back to our scenario and following the guide, we would have figures placed like this once we were finished. Sometimes a scenario will also have special units which are marked with a badge. For example, these are British commandos, and to show that, we've added one of these tokens to them. Some spaces may also show these double-sided medals, and if so, you'll place them as indicated, like in this scenario where we have one in each of the villages. The rest of the tokens you can just place beside the board. Each side of the battlefield gets 4 dice, along with a set of these card holders. Now you'll have each player pick a side to represent, playing as either the Allies or Axis armies, sitting on the long side of the board by their forces. In this case, the Allied forces begin here, arriving by sea to storm the beach, while the Axis player sits over here to prevent the enemy soldiers and tanks that rush to push through their positions. Now shuffle the cards with this back, which form the command deck, and place it face down between the players. You'll then check the scenario, and you'll see here that the Axis player is dealt 4 cards from the deck, and the Allied player starts with 5. Put these into your card holder, but be sure to keep them a secret from your opponent. The scenario will also indicate which player goes first, and in this case it will be the Allied player. And that's the setup. In Memoir 44, players are commanders controlling opposing armies in scenarios that are modeled after events from World War II, each with different battlefields and even different types of armies. Many will also include special rules for how the game is played, shown here within the scenario. And the conditions for victory may also vary from game to game, though in general terms, to win, you'll be required to earn a certain number of medals, usually by defeating enemies. But the scenario may also provide other ways to gain medals, as we'll see later. Players may also enjoy playing the same scenario back to back, but switching sides, and then adding together the medals they've earned from both of their games to get a final score to determine the winner. And this can help balance out the advantages that certain armies had in different types of scenarios. Either way, the game is played over a series of turns, starting with the player whose army is said to go first based on that scenario. And on your turn, you'll perform 5 steps, starting with playing a command card. Here, you'll pick one of the cards in your holder, place it face up in front of you, and read it aloud to your opponent. There are 2 main types of commands: section cards, which have a green background, and tactics, which are gray. Tactics we'll talk about later. For now, let's go over some of the different types of section cards. These will always refer to a section of the battlefield as shown in the area here, either the left, right, center, or some combination of them. These sections are indicated on the battlefield with dashed lines and are always seen from the perspective of the person who is playing the card. So if the player here used this card that refers to the right flank, that would mean this area for them. But if their opponent was playing this card, they'd hold the card in this direction, and now the right flank for them would be this area here. Within the highlighted section of the card that you play, you will find a value that indicates the number of units you can issue orders to. For example, this allows me to issue orders to up to 3 of my units on the right side, while this one allows me to issue orders to all of my units in the center. A unit on a hex with a red dashed line running straight through the center of it is considered to be in both sections that it crosses. So the unit here could be chosen if the card targeted the right or the center section. That said, no matter how many orders the card allows, you must assign each one to a different unit within the related sections. So for example, this command allows us to issue 3 orders on the right side, so we would have to pick 3 different units. If we had fewer units within the section than the number of orders that you're allowed to issue, then you would just ignore any extras. If you play a tactics card instead, it does not show sections of the battlefield. Instead, you read its instructions and it will explain which units you can issue an order to. And we won't go over each of these, as you'll just follow the instructions printed on them, which will make more sense to you once you understand the rest of the rules of the game. Either way, after playing a command, the next step is to announce the specific units that you'll be activating for that turn. So if I played this one, I might declare that I plan to activate these 3. Then you go to the third step, moving units. Now, just because you assigned an order to a unit doesn't mean that you have to move it, but the ones that you plan to move, you'll do unit by unit, fully moving one before moving the next, and ensuring that you finish all planned movements before going to the next step. In a moment, we'll learn how far you can move each type of unit, but just know that when they move, you go from one hex to another. And you can even have a unit cross from one section into another one during its movement. On the other hand, you may never move into or through a hex occupied by another unit, even one of your own. Also, units always move as a group. You cannot leave some behind or split them up as you move. And there are also special rules for a unit's movement depending on its type, so let's go over each of them now. A unit made up of soldier figures is known as a unit of infantry and can move either 1 or 2 hexes when it's activated. But if it moves a full 2 hexes, it will not be able to battle in the next step, as we'll see. The exception to that rule is infantry with a special forces token. These may move 2 spaces and still battle. An armored unit is one made up of tanks, and it can move up to 3 hexes, and this will not affect its ability to battle in the next step. While we're talking about movement, I should point out that these Hedgehog Obstacles will not interfere with the movement of infantry. They can freely enter and exit those spaces with no penalty. However, armored units, or artillery units, which we'll be talking about in just a moment, cannot enter spaces with a Hedgehog Obstacle. This obstacle is known as wire, and any type of unit can enter a space with it, but as soon as they do, they must stop their movement. So if this armored unit was just beginning to move, it could normally go up to 3 spaces, but as soon as it enters here, it has to stop immediately. Another type of obstacle you may find on the map are bunkers like these, but their spaces can only be entered by infantry units, not by armor and not by artillery. Now sometimes the setup instructions will tell you to place artillery inside of a bunker, and that's allowed, but that artillery will never be able to leave that space. Artillery that starts the game outside of a bunker will be able to move on its turn, but at most only 1 space. And if artillery does move, it will not be able to battle in the next step. If instead you wanted artillery to be able to battle, then you would still activate it as normal, but you would leave it where it is and not move it. In addition to obstacles, we also have different types of terrain like forests and towns. Like moving into spaces with wire, any unit that moves into a forest or a town must immediately stop its movement. These spaces are known as beaches, and any unit that enters a beach hex during its turn will be able to move at most 2 spaces during that turn. So this armored unit, which could normally move up to 3 spaces, will now only be able to move 2. And this rule remains true even if that unit would enter other types of terrain later. For example, let's just say it's a new turn, and we have this armored unit moving from here. It now enters a beach space, and then enters this space, which normally wouldn't impact its movement at all. However, because it entered at least 1 beach space during its turn, it's now moved 2 spaces and must stop. This side of the board also has ocean spaces like these. A unit that moves onto an ocean hex may move a maximum of 1 space during that turn. So this infantry unit that normally would be able to move up to 2 spaces will have to stop here. Now just note, you don't have to remember all the different rules for how units move or how obstacles and various types of terrain affect that movement, because it's all summarized here on the included cards that you can set beside the board when you're first learning how to play the game. With that understood, now let's go to the battle step, where each unit that was issued an order can battle so long as its movement doesn't stop it from being able to. Remember, artillery that moves can't battle, and infantry that moves 2 spaces can't battle either. And although the different types of units will have some differences in how they resolve their attacks, they share a lot of similarities. So let's go back to the table and I'll show you how this works. To help with this, I'm just going to move the figures around on the battlefield in the way I need to set up the examples that I want to show. So first of all, what we need to understand when battling is that the ordered unit can only battle once per turn, but doesn't have to battle if it doesn't wish to. Also, when attacking, a single unit may not split its attack across multiple targets. And if there's an enemy directly adjacent to you, then you cannot attack another enemy that's further away. You must attack the target beside you. And this is known as a close assault. If there are multiple enemies that are directly adjacent to you, then you pick which one you wish to target. Now, if there is no enemy directly adjacent to you, then you can pick any enemy unit within range. Instead of performing a close assault attack, you are then said to be firing on them, and the distance you can attack will depend on the unit you're using. If you're attacking with infantry, it can target a unit that is 1, 2, or 3 hexes away. And to count the distances, just count the number of hexes to the target following the shortest possible path. This enemy, for example, is 1, 2 hexes away. This one is 1, 2, 3 hexes. And this one is 1, 2, 3, 4 hexes away, and that means it's out of range. Now, if you're attacking with an armored unit, it can also attack up to 3 hexes away, while an artillery unit can target a unit up to 6 hexes away. But distance is not the only factor that must be considered. You must also be able to see the enemy that you are targeting, which is known as having line of sight to it. Though this is a restriction that only affects infantry and armored units. Artillery units do not have to be able to see their target. To check line of sight, draw an imaginary line from the center of the attacker's hex to the center of the target hex. You cannot attack that target if any part of the line crosses an obstruction. And an obstruction is any other unit, friendly or enemy, or certain types of terrain, which includes forests, hedgerows, towns and villages, like this, bunkers, and hills. So in all of these cases, line of sight is blocked. Though there are some exceptions when it comes to hills, so let's take a closer look. If both the attacker and the target are on spaces that contain hills, that are connected through other hills, or are on separate hills with nothing that obstructs line of sight between them, then these do have line of sight to each other. You can think of it as them all being on the same elevation. However, if any other type of obstruction is between them, then now they don't have line of sight. Also, when checking line of sight, if the line only touches the exact edge of the obstructing hex, like it does when we draw line of sight from this unit to this one, then line of sight is not blocked. The line would actually have to go through the obstruction in some way to be considered blocked. I should also point out that the terrain of the target hex itself does not block line of sight, so this unit could target either one of these two enemies. Once a valid target that is within range and line of sight has been chosen, the attacker will roll a number of their battle dice based on the type of unit attacking and the distance to that target. For example, when attacking with infantry, you'll roll 3 dice if your target is in an adjacent space, you'll roll 2 dice if it's 2 spaces away, and only 1 die if it's 3 spaces away. Unlike infantry, an armored unit that is attacking will always roll 3 dice whether the target is 1, 2, or 3 spaces away. An artillery unit rolls 3 dice if the target is up to 2 spaces away, only 2 dice if the target is 3 or 4 spaces away, and 1 die if it is 5 or 6 spaces away. And again, you don't have to memorize any of this information because it's all found here on this player reference. Some terrain or obstacles can also affect the number of dice that you get to roll during an attack. For example, if this infantry unit was attacking the infantry here, because it's 2 spaces away, normally they would only roll 2 dice. However, when infantry is attacking from a space that contains wire, they roll 1 less die. Also, if the target of their attack is in forest terrain, then they lose another die as well. This means they would have no dice to roll, so effectively they cannot attack this unit. We won't go over the effects of each type of terrain or obstacle that you might encounter on the number of dice a unit gets to roll when it's battling. This will really depend on the scenario and type of terrain that it includes. So instead, I'd recommend that you check this appendix for those effects, and don't forget that there are summary cards to help you remember how each type of terrain and obstacle works, and just refer to those when you're playing. One thing I will point out is that casualties do not affect the number of dice a unit gets to roll during the battle step. For example, if this unit only had 1 figure left in it, it would still roll as many dice as it normally would at full health. Either way, once you have the correct number of dice to roll against your target, you'll roll them and check the results. In battle, the attacker scores 1 hit for each result matching the type of unit it is targeting. There are 2 sides of the dice showing this symbol, which scores a hit against an infantry unit. There's also 1 side that scores hits against tanks, and a grenade which scores a hit on any type of unit. And it's the only side that scores hits against artillery units. There are 2 other types of symbols you'll find on the dice, but all hits are resolved first before any other types of symbols. And for each hit scored, a figure is removed from the target unit and returned to the box. So in this example, if the infantry unit here was attacking this unit, then both of these results would count as hits, and 2 figures would be removed. Now, if an attack would ever remove the last figure from an enemy's unit, you claim that last figure and place it into an empty space of your medals track found on your edge of the board. This will count as 1 medal towards your victory. If you roll this symbol, it's considered a miss, though some tactics cards you play may ask you to roll a die, and in those cases, this symbol may provide some kind of result as explained on the card. After resolving all hits rolled, you then resolve any retreats, which are this symbol. And for each of these, the targeted unit must move 1 hex back towards its own side of the battlefield. So if you rolled 2 retreats, the unit would move 2 spaces back. And even if you rolled no hits, you would still resolve any retreats. Now, the player whose units are being forced to retreat will determine which direction they go, following certain restrictions. First, as mentioned, they must move back towards their own side of the battlefield. So in this case, they could technically move into either of these 2 spaces. However, they must still follow the regular rules for movement, meaning they couldn't actually enter this space because there's already figures here. The exception is terrain effects that would normally slow a unit down. Those are actually ignored. For example, this is a forest, so if the player chose to retreat in this direction, they can pass through the forest with their 2 moves, where normally when entering a forest, you would have to stop there. Now, if a unit could not retreat, let's say the 2 spaces behind them were impassable, then the figures would stay put. But for each space they could not retreat that they were supposed to, you would remove 1 figure from its hex. Again, I encourage you to read the rules related to the specific terrain in your scenario, as some will also affect retreats. For example, if your unit is in a space with sandbags, they ignore the first retreat symbol rolled against them. Otherwise, those are the general rules for combat. However, if an infantry or armored unit attacks an enemy adjacent to them, and the enemy is eliminated or forced to retreat, the attacking unit can choose to perform a move called taking ground, and this allows them to advance into the target hex, though terrain movement and other restriction rules would still apply. Also note, only infantry and armored units can do this. Artillery units, like this one, cannot take ground after an attack. If it is an armored unit that takes ground, it can perform an armor overrun combat, which means it can attack again for free if it has a valid target, following all of the usual rules for attacking. And if that second attack allows it to eliminate or force a target in close combat to retreat, it can take ground again. However, it can only choose to move in. It can't choose to perform a third attack. And those are the rules for battles. After all eligible units have battled based on the command card that you played, you then discard it and draw a new one from the deck, ending your turn. Now, if the deck would ever run out, just reshuffle the discard pile into a new one. Now, the next player will take their turn playing a card and resolving it, and then turns will continue back and forth like this until one of the players reaches the victory condition. For the scenario we set up, this means collecting 5 medals, and remember, each time you destroy an enemy unit, you collect one of those figures, scoring it as a medal. This scenario also says that any allied unit on a town hex with a medal also counts that towards their total as well. But only allied units can claim these. And if they move off of the space or are eliminated, that medal no longer counts towards their total. The first player to achieve the conditions of victory, which for this scenario means earning 5 medals, will be declared the winner. And you'll also find rules for games with more than 2 players, including team play and much larger Overlord games, as well as rules for younger generals and for creating additional scenarios. The game also has a wide selection of expansion products that you can pick up separately. This is the Eastern Front, and it comes with a complete Russian army, 44 new terrain tiles, as well as new tokens, units, obstacles, and rules for 8 new scenarios. The terrain pack provides 66 new tiles and 22 new landmark tiles to mix into your games, including things like prisoner camps, radar stations, airfields, and so on. You also get new obstacles and unit badges, as well as 4 new included scenarios. The Winter Wars expansion adds 88 new tiles, as well as new obstacles, tokens, new decks of cards, including some for a breakthrough style of play, and 10 new scenarios. Also, at the time of this recording, a brand new expansion called New Flight Plan has just released. This comes with 21 new scenarios that adds these planes to your forces, new air combat cards, machine guns, bomb markers, and lots more. And this will bring a whole new dynamic to the battles that you play out with your opponents. But all of these expansions I'll leave for you to discover on your own. That said, if you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notifications anytime we post a new video. But until next time, thanks for watching.